it was felt that we need to have some sort of academic activity at a national level to really apprise doctors at all hospitals which are managing COVID, whether government, private, whether at a district level or at a state level or a tertiary hospital. And the aim was to bring down mortality. Ultimately, what will really matter as far as COVID-19 is concerned is the number of deaths, not the number of cases. And our aim is that we should bring our mortality down to less than 1%. COVID is a national crisis, and it's a novel new virus, and therefore we are learning everything about this virus as we go along. And there are new challenges that we're facing every day, both in terms of infection control, in terms of the systemic manifestation of COVID-19, and new guidelines emerging in terms of newer treatments, steroids, anticoagulants, or the antiviral drugs. And therefore there was a need that was felt that we should have some sort of a common platform to discuss these clinical issues. Already at various levels, webinars are being done for COVID-19, but it was felt that for clinicians it's important to have a case-based learning with real-life issues and real-life cases. And that is why we decided to have a COVID Grand Round. AIIMS New Delhi is anchoring it as a national activity, but we would like to have participation from all over the country, both from the government sector and the private sector. We will encourage individuals to participate not only as audience, but even for case presentation and also as expert faculty in the discussion which we will have in the coming weeks. And therefore, I would like to take this opportunity to invite all academic institute or hospitals and all doctors who would like to present cases or be part of the expert faculty to either write to us, send us an email, and we'll see in whatever way we can accommodate you. We would like to have a national participation from the north to the south, from the east to the west. It's important that we look at all issues, and today we are actually looking at the issue of how do we really manage issues and the importance of testing, what is the value of various tests, and we know that there are a large number of tests which have now become available. There were controversies with the antibody testing, and now we have a rapid antigen testing kit. So how do they help, and what do you do when you have a classical clinico-radiological profile but your test turns out to be negative? So this is what we're going to discuss today, but as we go along having this on a weekly basis, we will discuss other issues from management to managing, say, neurological manifestation, gastrointestinal manifestation, or pregnancy with a patient who is COVID positive. So these are all the issues that we will discuss in the coming weeks. I would like to take this opportunity to really thank Niti Aayog, the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, the Board of Governors, the Medical Council of India, my entire faculty for really coming together and pushing forward for this national COVID Grand Round, and I hope it's a success. We would want to have a feedback from you how we can improve. There's always room for learning. And now, without wasting much time, I would like to just introduce the panelists that we have for today. I have on my left Professor Rajeshwari. She is the head of pulmonary critical care and pain management, anesthesia, critical care and pain as far as All India Institute of Medical Sciences is concerned. On the right, we have Professor Ashu Seth from the Department of Radiology, and her main interest is pulmonary radiology. And then I have Professor Lalit Dhar, who is from microbiology and in charge of the virology lab. And we will start now with the case. I'll ask Dr. Bikesh, who is an associate professor, Department of Anesthesia, Pain Medicine and Critical Care, for the case presentation, after which we will have a discussion, or we'll have the discussion at the end. So over to Dr. Bikesh.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everybody. Today we'll be discussing two cases related to testings of COVID-19. Coming to the first case, it's a 41-year female weighing around 90 kilos, presented with us with a history of fever for 4 days, dry cough for 3 days, and shortness of breath for 3 days. The fever was continuous and high grade, although not documented. It was associated with cough and generalized weakness. It subsided with parastamol and not associated with any rash, joint pain, vermiculation, headache, or gastrointestinal symptoms. The cough was dry in nature, acute in onset and gradually progressing over the last 2 days. It was not associated with any chest pain, change in voice, heartburn, or urinal or postural variation. The shortness of breath was since last 3 days, and the patient was having difficulty in breathing even at rest. She is a known hypertensive since last 2 years. The blood pressure was controlled on 10% and 40 mg once daily. There is no history of any recent travel. There is no history of any contact with any diagnosed or suspected case of COVID-19. At arrival at AIMS and primary assessment, she was conscious oriented. Her vitals were GCS was 50. She was tachycardic with a heart rate of 122 per minute. Blood pressure was 107 by 81 mm mercury. Respiratory rate was 24 per minute. Her room air saturation was 69%. However, it includes up to 90% with oxygen by face mask at 10 liters per minute. Emergency blood investigation and COVID sample in the form of nasopharyngeal throat swab are sent for RT-PCR. Patient was started on IV fluids and antibiotics. In view of SARI symptoms and COVID suspect, the patient was shifted to the COVID suspect ward. In the COVID suspect ward, the patient was not maintaining the saturation even with oxygen by face mask at 10 liters per minute. So, in trial of non-invasive ventilation was given with a FiO2 of 80%. Support of 12 cm water and peak of 8 and awake Cronenberg as well. Despite this, she deteriorated over within next 2 hours. The saturation dipped to 78% with the oxygen of 100%. Respiratory rate was 38 per minute. The blood gas shows acidosis and hypoxemia. She was intubated and started on mechanical ventilation with small support ventilation in a volume control mode with a FiO2 of 0.7%, target of 400 ml, respiratory rate of 20 per minute, and peak of 8 cm of water. These are the chest X-ray and non-ultrasound findings. Now I will invite Professor Asu, who is a professor in the Department of Radiology at AIMS, to describe and give us the idea how to interpret the chest X-ray and non-ultrasound in case of COVID suspect. Dr. Asu.
Thank you, Dr. Vikash. So we have the chest radiograph and the lung ultrasound. At a casual glance, what you can make out in the chest radiograph is that whatever abnormality we have is most certainly multifocal and is bilateral. How we are going to interpret this abnormality, I will come to later. What does the lung ultrasound show? Lung ultrasound shows us an irregular hypoechoic area which is located in the subpleural location and is showing the shred sign or fractal sign indicating a consolidation. Also there is thickening of the pleural line, but if you notice that the number of B lines at this time point are not increased and are within normal limits. So essentially a subpleural consolidation. What importance do we give to this chest radiograph? Whenever we see a chest radiograph in context of a clinically suspected COVID, at the end of that interpretation, we should be able to give this information. Do we think it's normal or abnormal, which is evident in our patient? Do we think that this is non-COVID or a classical COVID? And then there is an area in between which is indeterminate. So either classical or probable, non-COVID or can't say. One of these categories should be assigned to the radiograph, and on what basis do we do it? The classical has been described as lower lobe, predominant, peripheral, multiple areas. Let's see some examples. Now we have tried to divide this into several patterns, and in fact these patterns appear in the current special issue of the Annals of NAMS. The most classical pattern which has been associated with COVID is this. The peripheral consolidation, which is like kissing the lateral chest wall, which is in a pre-pandemic area, we would have called this a reverse batwing, highly suggestive of an eosinophilic pneumonia. But in current scenario, it has come to be associated like a signature of COVID-19. The second pattern is multifocal consolidation, which is lower lobe dominant. Yeah, so you see a lot of air bronchogram. The retrocardiac area is also abnormal, while the entire lung shows some prominent bronchovascular markings, but the lower zones are the ones which have taken the hit. The third scenario is of a very rounded looking consolidation. So all of these patterns can be seen in COVID-19, which is predominantly distributed along the vessels. This is called the peribronchial pattern of consolidation. Another one is that it's multifocal, it's bilateral, but it does not show any of the classical distributions which we have seen. A pattern we have described is what we are calling a ball pattern, but actually it's just a round pneumonia. Round pneumonia has typically been associated with pediatric pneumonia, but we have seen it in a lot of chest radiographs of COVID-19 and has also been described on CT scans as rounded areas of consolidation. What looks like hilar nodes here are not hilar nodes. This is all peribronchial consolidation. And lastly, in the most severe forms, you will get this classical bilateral lower lobe symmetrical in extensive consolidation, which will be labeled as ARDS because based on the ventilatory requirements plus the radiographic picture. These are the 6 patterns which I just described. Now let's apply this knowledge to our index case. We do see lesions which are bilateral. They are both in the bilateral lower lobes as well as upper lobes. Some are like consolidation, showing you air bronchograms, and some have a more mass-like appearance. The ultrasound already showed us that these are subpleural in location. So what would our final report read? Our final report would have read, it is a probable COVID-19 pattern. So Bikash will take over again.
Thank you. So with this, during this period, the patient developed hypertension despite fluid therapy. So the right IJP was conducted and she was started on low dose of noradrenaline infusion. The COVID-19 test, the RT-PCR for the COVID-19 came to be negative. Normally, one of the patients came with a negative report of COVID-19. We sent the patient out of the suspect ward into the admitting unit. However, in this case, due to a high level of suspicion, high requirement of FiO2 and vasopressor, the patient was not shifted out of the COVID suspect area. Over the next 24 hours, she further deteriorated with higher requirement of oxygen, ventilator support, and vasopressor support. Her investigations came out to be hemoglobin of 7.9 gram per deciliter. TLC was 9,400, platelet 2,99,000. The urea and creatinine are elevated. The creatinine are around 3.4 milligram per deciliter. So at 24 hours, a repeat ultrasound shows a gross findings in all the zones. You can see that the pleural line abnormalities, which is irregular and thickened pleura, these are B lines. You can see which are multiple B lines throughout the lung field. The confluence of B line, which is producing this white lung image, and subpleural consolidations, which produces these red signs. So these features are not exclusive of this COVID pneumonia. These can be found in other pathologies. However, the combination of these patterns and the nature of distribution may suggest a COVID pneumonia. So if you see, if the lung is divided, the whole of the lung is divided into 12 zones. In the right side, there is 6 zones, and the left side 6 zones. And we can find out the pleural line abnormalities are found around 11 zones. The B lines are found also in 11 zones, out of which 8 zones, these are multifocal and confluence producing a white lung. And the red sign was found in around 10 zones. In view of clinical features history of COVID-19, worsening clinical conditions and worsening radiological features, a repeat RT-PCR was planned for COVID test. The tracheal aspirate was sent for the reverse transmitted PCR. This time the repeat RT-PCR was found to be positive for COVID-19. The patient was further managed as per AIMS COVID-19 guidelines. So this is the first case. Coming to the second case scenario. Here is a 52-year female weighing 60 kg, presented with us with a history of fever for 3 days, dry cough for 1 day. The fever was high grade, maximum temperature was 103 degrees Fahrenheit. It was associated with generalized weakness, not associated with any chills, rigor, rash, joint pain, burning, maturation, headache, or any gastrointestinal symptoms. The cough was dry in nature and not associated with chest pain, change in voice, heartburn, or any duodenal or postural variation. She is a hypertensive since last 2 years. Blood pressure was controlled on medication. Also a diabetic since last 2 years. The blood sugars are controlled on oral hypoglycemic agents. She is a nursing staff working at our institute, but working in a non-COVID area. There is no history of any recent travel. There is a history of contact with a COVID-19 patient 8 days before, but the nature of the contact is not well defined. At arrival at AIMS during primary assessment, she was conscious, oriented, her vitals were GCS is 50, pulse rate is 98 per minute, blood pressure is 148/94 millimeter mercury. And also there is productive cough and shortness of breath. So some blood and radiological investigation are advised. Her blood investigation came out to be hemoglobin of 12.2 gram per deciliter, total leukocyte count of 5,500, and other investigation was found to be in the normal range. Her chest X-ray, CT scan is done. So this is the CT scan of this patient. Now again, like asked to Dr. Asu to tell us regarding how to interpret the CT scan in case of COVID suspect.
Thank you, Bikash. So similar to the chest radiograph in this patient, this is the CT scout film which was normal. But if we look at the subsequent axial lung CT images, again similar to radiograph of the patient 1, we see bilateral lesions. What is the location of these lesions? Lower lobes. In terms of central and peripheral, what is the location of the lesion? It is again subpleural, abutting the pleura. Here it's abutting the mediastinal or the paravertebral pleura. Here it is abutting the costal pleura, but all the lesions are abutting a pleural surface. It has a very well-defined kind of border, but there is a central clearing. Central areas are low density, which we refer to as an atoll sign or the reverse halo sign. If you imagine the secondary pulmonary lobule and see the small lesion which has been pointed here with this red arrow is almost as if one secondary pulmonary lobule, this is the coverage of a secondary pulmonary lobule, turned into a ground glass. And this is as if several secondary pulmonary lobules are confluent now to form a larger lesion. So to summarize, we already stated the location, multiplicity, rounded appearance and the presence of atoll sign. So if this was a non-COVID world, what would we have called this? We would have called this organizing pneumonia. And again, to illustrate its relationship to pleural surfaces, the relationship to the pleural surfaces is a very important pointer. Just as in chest radiograph, you have to assign a risk category to the CT. So some obligatory and confirmatory patterns are described. These are very similar to what I already covered, but the key words here are fissures. You must remember that the fissures also have pleural surfaces, so the lesions may not appear next to the chest wall or mediastinum, but can be hanging from the fissures. They can have both ill-defined or well-defined margins. We had both of these type of lesions, and if you see, organizing pneumonia has been placed as one of the confirmatory patterns. Based on this risk assessment, as we know, there is a reporting and data system, RAD system for several organs now, like we have lung RADs for lung cancer screening, BI-RADs, which basically gives a risk assignment score, which for organizing pneumonia pattern will come as CORADS 5, which means very high and typical for COVID-19. And if it was not the time of pandemic, the closest differential will be connective tissue diseases. So in our index case, we advised both a repeat of the COVID-19 test as well as a search for RT-PCR since she had unexplained fever. So back to Bikash now.
Thank you, ma'am. So in view of history of contact, continuing symptoms of severity of COVID and chest CT scan finding, so a repeat RT-PCR was planned. Now, a nasopharyngeal and throat swab was again said for repeat RT-PCR. The repeat RT-PCR was found to be positive for COVID-19. So, she was again managed as per the AIMS COVID-19 guidelines. This is the COVID-19 guidelines of AIMS, which we follow for managing all the cases. Unfortunately, for the first patient, she did not survive. However, the second patient was discharged home after a few days of hospital stay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bikash, for an excellent presentation and highlighting the problem that we face. These are two real life cases that we've seen as far as the All India Institute of Medical Sciences are concerned. And they highlight two issues. One is that at times you may have a classical clinico-radiological profile, but your initial test may turn out to be negative. And then the whole issue is, how do we go about approaching these cases? Or you may have a patient who has come to you and you did not suspect COVID-19, or the test could not be done for some reason, and then a CT scan was done, and this came with these classical pictures. And then the issue becomes, what should you do now when you have a classical radiological picture, whether it's the X-ray or the CT, suggesting COVID-19, but you don't have a positive test as of now, in terms of managing the case and in terms of preventing infection spreading to the others. So before I take up the questions, or we have a subsequent presentation on investigation, I just remind everyone that they could send their questions through WhatsApp, the number being 9999 692364. So I'll repeat that again, 9999 692364. You could send the questions on WhatsApp and we'll try and answer all of them. I now invite Dr. Rajeshwari to summarize and give us some idea as to what happened in terms of the follow-up of these cases, and just a brief review of what was done.
So thank you, sir. So the first patient was an overweight. She was 90 kilos and she had hypertension as a comorbidity. And it was seen that in the beginning she presented with hypoxemia but without any symptoms. So we call these patients as happy hypoxemics. She had a saturation of about 60% on room air. And she was then given oxygen. So this patient, after oxygen therapy, and when her initial ultrasound was done, and she also had an initial testing done, turned out to be negative. But in her case, she rapidly deteriorated both from the point of respiratory as well as from the hemodynamic point of view. She required vasopressor support as well as ventilatory support, and her repeat radiological investigations were very, very suggestive of COVID. So as Dr. Guleria highlighted, it is very, very important to have a very high index of suspicion, especially nowadays when we are in the pandemic and as it is evolving. So because of that high index of suspicion, the patient was not transferred to her parent ward out of the COVID ward in spite of the RT-PCR being negative, and we were therefore we wanted to carry out the test again because of her positive findings, which ultimately turned negative. Unfortunately, she had a very rapid downward spiral and we lost this patient. Coming to the second patient, although this patient came and she had two comorbidities, she had a slightly more prolonged history, and she also had a very vague history of a contact with a COVID positive patient, and that was what prompted us to keep her in the COVID suspect area in spite of her also having a first initial negative test. This patient continued to have fever and also respiratory symptoms, although she did not deteriorate to the point of requiring ventilatory support. But because of these findings and the continuation of, and of course, finding new findings on the ultrasound, and we finally decided to do a CT for her as per the advice of the radiologist. So as you recently saw, the CT was highly suggestive of COVID-19, and which was proved to be so when the RT-PCR was repeated. Therefore, the message we get is twofold. One thing is that we have to give a lot of importance to the clinico-radiological findings of the patient. In spite of the test turning negative, tests have to be interpreted in the light of the patient's findings. And secondly, it's very important not to rush these patients to a place where there is a likelihood of transmission to other patients. We must have an area in the hospital, a well-designated hospital, a designated place where these patients can be kept till they are actually proved to be COVID positive or negative. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe I can now ask Professor Ashu Seth to just give us a brief on when to use an X-ray and CT scan for diagnosis. And I'll just also ask her just to give us an idea of how sensitive and specific do you think a chest X-ray and a CT scan are in a situation where for some reason the COVID test is not available or could not be done.
So our strategy we are addressing only diagnosis part today and not management of COVID-19, but for us, at the forefront of this battle has been the chest radiograph. What we have done is that we are fortunate to have 2 X-ray machines in the casualty, and we have divided these 2 into one COVID suspect and one for all other regular patients. So in our ER itself, if there is a SARI patient who comes, patient undergoes a chest radiograph. I already showed you the kind of atlas that we have created for people on ground, which is the physicians or the radiologists who are on duty, for them to be able to see these patterns, and they are able to recognize that whether it is a COVID pattern or not. I didn't show you all the non-COVID patterns, but it's very classical. You can clearly tell this is not a streptococcus pneumonia, or this is not tuberculosis, and this looks more like a viral pneumonia. Can you tell on chest radiograph itself? Yes. There will be a whole lot which will be gray, but at least the clear ones get cleared. So we clearly give it a term that this is a COVID pattern, and the patient can move straight to the COVID suspect unit while patient is awaiting the results of the test. Now, what happens if the chest radiograph is normal, the chest radiograph is indeterminate, or the test is negative, then we recommend a CT scan in these cases. The sensitivity of a chest radiograph has been reported anywhere between 55 to 60% approximately, and a specificity in a similar range. In a CT, the reports have been very variable, but the sensitivity and specificity claimed is in excess of 70 to 90% by various studies. But I think when Dr. Lalit speaks later, we'll come back to this subject, because the specificity depends on the current scenario. For instance, I labeled the OP as COVID because there is a raging pandemic. But in regular situation, I would have said I want to know the ANA first. So it depends on the prevalence of the disease in your population at that time in terms of specificity.
Thank you very much. So I think we've had a number of questions coming through the WhatsApp, and some of them are related to the issues that this case has raised in terms of what would you do if the second test also was negative, which I think is an important issue that we will address when we take the question and answers as far as this case is concerned, or managing COVID-19 is concerned. Other questions are actually generic. I'll try and see whether we can, or the panel can actually address them to some extent. But as we move forward, let's have a brief presentation by Professor Lalit Dhar on the investigation or the testing that can do, because a number of the questions are based on the utility of these tests, and like I mentioned in the beginning, we have a number of tests which are available. What is their utility, and how and when should we use them? I think those things will be highlighted. So I'll request Dr. Lalit Dhar to summarize the testing strategy and the tests that are available and how useful they are as far as COVID-19 is concerned. Over to you, Dr. Lalit.
Good afternoon. I'll be speaking about the clinical approach to the laboratory test for COVID-19. If you look at the virus, this is just to highlight the antigens that are present for which the genes are detected in the real-time PCR. You can see that right on the surface is the spike antigen, and below that is the envelope. Below that the membrane, which is not really used, but the nucleocapsid is again another target for the tests. The open reading frames 1A and B, which are not expressed in the virus per se, but the genes are present, is also one of the targets for these tests. The sample collection for COVID-19 would entail mainly the collection of nasopharyngeal swabs or throat swabs, along with a nasal swab, using appropriate PPE. Respiratory tract samples, but upper respiratory tract samples are collected in viral transport medium or lysis buffer, using specific swabs, which are preferably flocked swabs, so that you can get enough material from these samples, and then transported to the laboratory, maintaining a cold chain at the earliest. The tests can be categorized as nucleic acid amplification tests or NATs, tests for antigen, and tests for antibodies. The most commonly used test at this point of time, which is also considered the gold standard, is the real-time PCR test. The first test introduced in India was an in-house test developed by the National Institute of Virology, Pune. which was supplied through ICMR to all the laboratories. This had WHO endorsed primers and probes based on certain publications which are mentioned here. Subsequently, many commercial real-time PCR platforms have come up. These include open platforms where you can use any of the various kits which are validated and approved by the ICMR and granted emergency use authorization by various international agencies. The closed platforms that are available are also used, and these are more important for high throughput testing. Then you have the near point of care rapid real-time PCR platforms. And other methods for real-time PCR include isothermal amplification with CRISPR-based detection or transcription-mediated amplification, for which again a commercial system is available. RT-PCR is considered the gold standard and has the highest sensitivity. It has a very low limit of detection at less than 10 copies, and it has a high throughput feasibility. Except for point-of-care platforms which have a low throughput. It has a good turnaround time and can give results on the same day within a few hours. The near point-of-care test can give you results within a couple of hours, and there are a large variety of tests available commercially. The challenges with real-time PCR are that you need a biosafe and biosecure laboratory setup with adequate equipment, well-trained and experienced staff, expensive equipment and consumables, expertise in the technique and interpretation, and a turnaround time of at least 6 hours, especially for except for near POC platforms, which includes sample processing, RNA extraction, and the PCR itself. The other challenge is that at this point of time, there are a variety of kits which are available with different parameters. Gene targets vary. It could be one or more of the E gene target or the ORF1ab or the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase of the virus, or the nucleocapsid, or the spike and antigen genes. And these are in various combinations, and therefore the labs, since they are getting the supplies as per availability, sometimes have to adapt to different kits. There are various formats available: single or more wells per sample, or monoplex and multiplex platforms, both are available. There are different controls in different kits. Some have housekeeping gene controls which give a little more information. Others have just a process internal control. And all the kits have different cutoffs and interpretative criteria, all these things are challenges which the laboratories are gearing up, and they have been doing for a while now, and managing very well with all these variations. The other tests which are available for COVID are those tests which are used for rapid detection of nucleic acid and antigen. The near point of care RT-PCR platforms are mostly closed platforms. This includes the Indian TrueNat. Others are the Cepheid Expert Express, Abbott ID Now, BioMelu, BioFire, etc. All these are closed platforms. The rapid point of care antigen test is also available since a while now, and it's an immunochromatographic test based on the lateral flow technology. It detects antigen in the nasopharyngeal swabs, and many commercial kits are now available. One of them has been evaluated at AIIMS, validated at AIIMS, and also at ICMR. And this kit has a turnaround time of about 15 minutes. The AIIMS data showed good sensitivity for this test at 81% sensitivity and excellent specificity at 99.4%. Negative tests in symptomatic patients are advised to be confirmed by real-time PCR. And then we have the antibody test. The antibody tests detect either total immunoglobulin against the SARS coronavirus 2, which is IgG plus IgM without discriminating between the two, or they detect IgM, which will indicate acute or recent infection, or they will detect IgG, which is basically an indicator of past infection. The antigen used for this detection could be mostly the nucleocapsid antigen, because that is quite conserved, but some of these tests also include the spike antigen. There are also tests available which use whole virus lysate. Various test formats are available. An ELISA is available, which has been developed also in India called COVID Kavach by NIV. Then there are other ELISA commercial vendors also who have been approved. CLIA is another platform which is used, another principle, and in that many closed platforms are now available commercially. And finally, we have some immunochromatographic or lateral flow tests for antibody detection, which are rapid point of care, but have some issues of sensitivity and specificity. If you see the graph which I have put here, you will see that both the tests, the IgM peaks around 3 weeks, but it starts around 1 week. Similarly, the IgG can also start rising around 1 week, but peaks a little later around 4 weeks. And after that, the IgG will persist for a while and the IgM will start coming down. Now, this was in the context of the case that we just discussed, and this question has come up many times in many publications, whether one should do a real-time PCR or a CT test for the diagnosis. And they put a big or between the two. Let us see if that is warranted. If you look at one prevalence goes down below 10%, then using chest CT directly instead of a real-time PCR would be would not be a very good idea. False negative real-time PCRs is again, it's a very important issue which has been raised various times. We need to see the extent of this first. A large study from Stanford University and University of Washington in 590 patients with high clinical suspicion and a negative first RT-PCR found that a second RT-PCR within 7 days was positive in 3.5%. So this was the additional pickup. Another systematic analysis found that you could pick up another 8.5% with a second test. However, the second systematic analysis thought that the evidence was low certainty due to high heterogeneity and a risk of bias in the studies. If you see, the reason for that was essentially, if you look at the type of specimens which I have highlighted, many of these studies were using throat swabs alone. They were not using what we use here in India, which is a combination of a throat swab along with a nasal swab, and there are reasons why the nasal swab is extremely important. Also, they did not specify the RT-PCR brand in many of these studies, initial studies, and that was a limitation. Now, what could be the possible causes? The causes for false negativity could be etiological, which means that there could be agents other than the SARS coronavirus too. And especially during the season for influenza and other respiratory viruses, this is a possibility. And in many parts of the country, the monsoon is the season when the influenza virus also makes a comeback and other respiratory viruses also circulate. So one has to be very careful that you may not miss a diagnosis of another respiratory virus. Another set of reasons could be analytical, and this could be, there has been a question about the low sensitivity of real-time PCR or specific kits. I'll address that in a couple of slides. Laboratory testing issues could be there, that perhaps the PCR could be inhibited by inhibitory substances, but that has been addressed too. I'll just speak about that a little more in detail. The most important causes for tests being negative are actually pre-analytical, and there are a number of studies in various contexts that have shown that. It could be sample collection of transport, which is an issue, so that it could be an inadequate sample, there could be a delay in transport, or the appropriate temperature may not be used for transportation. Inappropriate site of sampling for the stage of the disease is another thing we need to look at. Now, if you look at the analytical sensitivity, the limit of detection of all the tests varies between 0.9 copies per ml to somewhere around 8.26 copies per ml. So whether you are looking at the regular commercial non-POC RT-PCRs, the in-house RT-PCR, or the point-of-care RT-PCRs, all of them have a limit of detection which is less than 10 copies. So the test is actually, the analytical sensitivity is excellent. And all the kits that are used in India are validated by ICMR. So let us see how many copies are actually shed in patients. So if you look at these curves on the right side, you will see that if you look at the days since onset of symptoms right from the beginning, you would be picking up in nasal swabs and throat swabs adequate amount of virus, which is varying between 10 to the power 4 to 10 to the power 8 copies per ml. I'm sorry for that typo there. As we have said, if a test is picking up 10 copies and the range within the first week is 10 to the power 4 to 10 to the power 8 copies, you are highly unlikely to miss it. The other issue is we must remember that the nasal swabs have a much higher viral load than the throat swabs. So that sample must not be missed under any circumstances. It must be added along with the throat swab to the viral transport medium. The RT-PCR is very unlikely, therefore, to miss acute upper respiratory COVID in the first week, given the high viral loads and the LOD of the test. Now, could it be a quality issue? Could it be that the samples are not adequate? Well, there is a process, there is a sample internal control in the kits, which looks at the housekeeping genes, and these genes are for the RNase P or the beta globin, which are always present. And these are detected in the sample all the way through from the processing to the nucleic acid extraction, and at the end in the RT-PCR, those should show up. If they don't show up, then it means the sample is inadequate, and that is what we communicate to the concerned department to repeat the sample. Another control which is there in some kits which do not have the housekeeping gene is an added internal control. This is added during the extraction process from outside, and this confirms the nucleic acid extraction and the RT-PCR process only, but does not actually assess sample quality. So this is one of the things which the labs need to look at, whether their test has a housekeeping gene control or not, or does it just have an internal control, which is a process control. Nevertheless, these things are very much incorporated into the testing. We also have good external quality assurance. We have a reverse EQA, meaning that some number of positives and negative samples are sent to other laboratories for confirmation to the higher level laboratory. And in our case, since we are a regional laboratory of the ICMR, it goes to NIV for confirmation. And then there is the accreditation process, which has been made necessary for many of the labs, and many labs are taking it up, just as we have at AIIMS. So then the final issue is, then what was the problem in these cases? I think the issue was basically getting the right sample at the right time. If you take an early acute respiratory infection, a nasal swab deep from both the nasal cavities plus a throat swab is adequate, as we have said. But if you have an acute severe lower respiratory tract infection, where you know that the virus is now gone into the lungs, it has gone into the lower respiratory tract, it is possible, especially after 7 days of illness, that the test may turn out negative. And therefore, we have suggested in our institute, and we have been doing this here, that particularly, the first thing is, of course, you repeat the above samples, and there is always a chance you may pick up some of the virus which is still being shed. The virus, of course, continues to be shed. The RNA is detectable till a median of 20 days, and it can continue to be detectable till 37 days, although viable virus is only there till about 8 days. But it may be intermittently picked up if the virus has already gone into the lower respiratory tract and the upper respiratory sample is taken. So we suggest that we repeat the sample. The other thing is, if the patient is intubated, it's a good idea to add a bit of the endotracheal aspirate, about half an ml, in the same BTM as the nasal swab. This is an improvisation which we have been using here successfully. There are no recommendations as yet, but we know that endotracheal samples can pick up lower respiratory tract infections far better than an upper respiratory sample. There is an alternative sample, the bronchoalveolar lavage, but because it has a high risk of aerosolization, it is highly unlikely that this sample will be sent. So, to summarize, the diagnosis of coronavirus disease does not only require RT-PCR or CT. That should not be an or, it should be an and. So both of them have a time and a place where they can be used. I would just like to thank finally all our virology laboratory staff who have been working tirelessly without a single word of complaint, always with a smile, and the lab has not taken a single break, including Sundays and holidays, since 2nd February 2020. I'm sure this is true of many other labs who have joined in today and many other institutions who have joined in today, and this is the time to remember them all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we've had a large number of questions also to our panelists, and since many of them are related to clinical matters, I've asked Professor Anant Mohan, who is Professor and Head Department of Pulmonary Critical Care and Sleep Medicine, also to join us to really address a number of these questions. Some of them are related to the issues that this case highlighted, and some are more general. I'll try and take both of them. So maybe we'll just continue with where Dr. Lalit left off, and I'll ask him the first question, which has been raised, is what is the ideal time for taking a nasal and a throat swab?
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that question. The ideal time, actually, as early as possible in infection would be the best. Because as I have shown, right from day one, in fact, from about 3 days before the person turns symptomatic, you can detect the RNA by real-time PCR, and definitely during the first week, there is no issue in detecting it.
And also in continuation, what is the role of the rapid antigen test in asymptomatic individuals? Do you think it's something that has a high pickup?
Yes, so in our evaluation showed that the antigen test which we evaluated had a sensitivity of more than 80%. ICMR also did a parallel evaluation, and they found that though the overall sensitivity they reported was a little less, if you look at the document closely, you will find that that about 75% of those who had a CT value of 30, which means that those who are potentially infectious were picked up. So the sensitivity for the antigen test is actually very good, and it has a clear-cut role even in asymptomatics, because we have seen that in asymptomatics the viral load does not differ from that in symptomatics. The amount of virus is usually the same.
Thank you. The other question is by a doctor who's raised an issue which is more personal, that her RT-PCR is still positive after 45 days. And the CT value is 25. What next, and what should she do?
Yeah, that is unusual, but it is possible. We have seen, I would say that she should get a proper workup for seeing if she is not immunocompromised in any way. That would be a concern. People can keep shedding the virus, although the CT value they mention is 25, but it depends on the kit, because some of these kits actually skip 5 cycles. So I don't know which kit has been used, so it is difficult to say. But the thing is, the RNA can be detected as long as maybe even more than a month it has been shown in certain cases, but it does not mean that they are shedding live virus. So that is a positive.
So I do agree with you. I think she should not get too much concern. You can shed viruses which may or may not be live for a long period of time, and if you're symptomatically all right, she should not worry in terms of her RT-PCR still being positive, but it has to be looked at as the entire picture is concerned. The rapid antigen kit is useful if you are symptomatic. The yield is going to be much higher if your pre-test probability is there, and then it will show a higher yield. But if you're doing it in the community and among a large number of asymptomatic individuals, the yield of the test will be less, because if your viral load is less, the rapid antigen test doesn't multiply the virus, and therefore it will not pick it up if your viral load is less. So you have to have a high viral load. Your CT value has to be much lower for it to become positive. So it's important to keep that in mind, and I think the guidelines are very clear that if you have a clinical suspicion, even if your rapid antigen test is negative, you must do an RT-PCR or a CBNAT, TrueNAT test to really be sure that you are not missing out on a COVID patient, because that patient can then be infectious and spread the infection in the community. Here I'll also like to say that many questions have asked about the AIIMS guidelines. The AIIMS guidelines are available on AIIMS website, that is aims.edu, and for all of the participants who want to really see the AIIMS guideline or have a look at them, you can download it from the AIIMS, the All Indian Institute of Medical Sciences AIIMS website at aims.edu. Thank you, Dr. Lalit. I may come back to you. I'll just then move on to Dr. Rajeshwari, because now we're having some general questions. And one question is that one doctor says that he's managing patients of COVID-19 in the ICU, but he has problems of weaning off patients from non-invasive ventilation. So what advice can you give him in terms of weaning from NIV?
So it depends on what kind of support of NIV the patient is on. So as long as the patient is able to maintain his saturation and also his work of breathing with whatever level of NIV you are giving, I think it is quite safe to continue it and probably give him some small periods of NIV and put him on the face mask and see how he does. However, there's nothing wrong in continuing the NIV even for a period of 2 weeks, as long as the patient can tolerate and is maintaining his blood gases on that. They normally have this period of requirement of ventilation depending on the seriousness of illness for up to a period of 2 weeks or even 20 days. So that has to be watched. And as soon as you feel that the work of breathing is coming down, he can be given a trial of NIV.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll also now get Dr. Anand Mohan in the picture, because there is a question which says, what is the role of anticoagulants in mild cases? Should we actually give anticoagulants to individuals who have mild illness and are not admitted? Do you think there is any role?
Actually no, because that we had seen earlier, and there was questions at the start of the pandemic when we were not very clear on the management strategies. So the thing is that most of the mild cases are likely to be ambulatory. So at that point of time, the policy was to admit all patients, whether mild, even asymptomatic, they had to be isolated. So they were basically in hospital, but they were ambulatory. So there was really no indication of giving any anticoagulation. The risk-benefit ratio did not really go in favor of anticoagulation. But yes, subsequently we realized when we saw more and more cases of thrombus, thromboembolic phenomenon, and DVTs, and a couple of strokes also, one realized that the moderate and the severe cases are the ones who should benefit, who will benefit. So we started anticoagulation in the moderate and above, moderate to severe category, and that is where the guidelines still are. All hospitalized patients who are moderate or severe should be given the benefit of prophylactic anticoagulation till they are hospitalized. Even after that, after discharge, it is not a uniform policy to continue anticoagulation, and that has been given in a recent thrombotic guideline also by the US. So as long as they are hospitalized, yes, prophylactic anticoagulation. In severe critical, there may be a case for even giving therapeutic anticoagulation doses as well, because that one will have to decide based on his saturation, etc.
So I think in mild cases there is really no indication. In those who are admitted with moderate disease, the current evidence does support giving prophylactic anticoagulant. You can use low molecular weight heparin. And in most ICUs, if the patient has severe illness, they would move on to giving a therapeutic dose of low molecular weight heparin or anticoagulants. You could also use unfractionated heparin if you wanted to. The main issue here is that we know that this causes a prothrombotic state, and there is hypercoagulation, which leads to a lot of extrapulmonary manifestation. But in the early or mild or asymptomatic stage, there is no evidence that it can be of much use. I'll then ask Rajeshwari another question, and this is basically on discharge from cytokine storm. If you have a patient who has recovered, when can you say that this patient who has now can be discharged?
So basically, if the patient was treated on the lines of cytokine storm, he would have received TCZ and other modalities of treatment. So clinical improvement would probably decide the time of discharge, because cytokine storm is a very life-threatening event, and obviously the patient would have been very ill and probably shown a lot of pulmonary manifestations and other markers of which suggest like high IL levels and so on. So as soon as the pro-inflammatory markers come down and he seems stabilized from the other points of view, I'm sure that can be decided, because then ultimately patients are discharged from the hospital only after they become clinically all right.
Thank you. I'll just now ask two questions from Ashu. One is by one of the participants, that when should you do a chest X-ray and when should you do a CT scan for diagnosis? And the second question is, do you think CT chest for screening pre-surgery asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic COVID is useful?
So Two questions. When to do the chest radiograph in all SARI patients? Actually, this is an extension of the guidelines for all CAP. All CAP, which means all SARI chest radiograph should be done, which means if patient has fever with any indication of a lower respiratory involvement, that in the form of increased respiratory rate or hypoxia. So once you label a patient as SARI, a chest radiograph should be done, and preferably in the ER itself or after the patient reaches the ward in a portable unit. So there's no doubt about the chest radiograph. In terms of CT for diagnosis in SARI, I already said if the chest radiograph is normal but patient is symptomatic, you're not sure of your pattern on the chest radiograph, and especially so if your microbiology diagnostics are inconclusive, then you should definitely do a CT scan. That is as far as diagnosis goes. Now we come to aerosol generating procedures. So, there will be a subset of patients who will be missed by the RT-PCR depending on the surgery that is being done. For instance, if a patient needs to be undergo a FES, it's all right to do both, because at that time you probably do want to reach sensitivity levels of 100%. So if your RT-PCR is negative and the anesthetist or the surgeon want, like several of our ENT colleagues especially ask us for this indication pre-FES, so I think it's better if patient has to undergo a high aerosol generating procedure, chest radiograph and RT-PCR are normal, it's better to exclude with CT itself. So yes, you can add on CT in that setting.
Thank you very much. There are certain other questions which I'll try and see if I can answer them, and then I'll ask Dr. Anant Mohan for one or two more. Role of ivermectin as prophylaxis, the role of famotidine plus ivermectin, and the role of inhaled steroids. So there is really no data which suggests that ivermectin is useful as prophylaxis. People have used a single dose of 12 milligram or a BD dose also, both for mild cases and for as prophylaxis. People have also in mild cases given ivermectin plus doxycycline. Some clinicians suggest that it really helps them, but I don't think we have enough evidence one way or the other to support its use. So currently the National Task Force, which looked at the guidelines and looked at the data for ivermectin, did not find it to be that useful based on the evidence and have not recommended. Regarding empirical antiviral, I don't think there is any role for empirical antiviral, especially in mild cases. There is no evidence to suggest that any of the antivirals, including remdesivir, actually has a role or has a mortality benefit in mild cases. So again, it is not indicated. I'll ask two questions to Dr. Anant Mohan. One is the role of bronchoscopy as far as COVID-19 is concerned, and what is the utility? Do you think N95 masks with valves are useful?
So the first question says the role of bronchoscopy. So basically, as already said, that if in the preferred modality, the preferred sample would be the upper respiratory tract. But if there is a subset of patients in whom we know that the lower respiratory tract is predominantly involved, and if suppose we are not able to get a positivity from the upper respiratory tract by any means, or there is no other method by which we get sample, then one goes in for the lower respiratory tract, and if the patient is intubated, then one goes for the endotracheal aspirate, and otherwise one can do a flexible bronchoscopy. So it is not that one can't do, and it is not that one should not do. If absolutely essential for a diagnosis, and if it is required for any management changes, for example, a person is critically ill and he develops fresh infiltrates in the lung, so one may suspect a VAP, or one may be suspecting some other organism, and one may like to do a bronchoscopy. So that is possible to do under proper precautions, under full precautions to the operator and to the technician. In fact, there are several guidelines for bronchoscopy in a COVID situation, which have also been come up by various international organizations, and even the IAB, the Indian Association of Bronchology, is coming out with their own position statement. So in that situation, I think it is possible to do that. The only thing is one should be clear about the indication and what role it will have in the management. Second question was the one with the walls, the mask with the walls. So I think that concern is coming up in the last couple of days again regarding the whether the valves, they kind of harm others, or they have the potential to harm others or to the person himself who's wearing the mask. Again, there is no hardcore data to this effect, but the only thing is that how it prevents the aerosols from collecting, from getting transmitted. So exhalation, is it prevented, and the person who's wearing the mask himself may be at risk. So I think these are some theories which are coming. So one really has, I really am not aware of any scientific or any evidence-based basis for that. But because the valves are a one-way valve and they have a tendency to trap the air inside, so there was this possibility that it may cause some problems to the person himself who's wearing it. But I think I'll ask others also to chip into this.
So thank you. I think as far as the mask is concerned, the whole issue has been that it can protect you, but if you are, because it has an expiratory valve, so if you are an asymptomatic individual, you could still pass on the infection to others because your expired air will go through the valve, which doesn't have a filter, and therefore the protection is not as much as it would be with a non-rebreathing valve. There are other questions. One is basically the significance of antibody testing. Maybe Lalit, you would like to answer that. And if a person who is COVID positive has recovered but is antibody negative, is it safe to return to work?
Well, as far as the antibody tests go, I think they will pick up the IgG in the serum, but whether an IgG in the serum is indicative of a recovery from a respiratory infection is not very clear. What percentage of people actually develop IgG after a mucosal infection is an issue to be pondered. But the thing is, if you have it, fine, that is good. That means you probably have had the infection and have recovered from it. If you don't have it, it doesn't mean that you've not had the infection, is what I would say, because it is possible that you may have developed other forms of immunity like mucosal IgA. You could have developed T-cell immunity, which could protect you in the long run too. So it is not an all or none thing as far as the IgG goes. There are some tests which are both IgG plus IgM positive, where it is very difficult to interpret, because there you could possibly have an ongoing infection or have had an infection in the past. In that case, possibly if you get that kind of test positive and you don't have a history, clinical history or a past RT-PCR positivity, then perhaps you should get tested at that point of time.
Thank you. One question for Rajeshwari which has just come up is, what do you suggest about percutaneous versus surgical tracheostomy in difficult to wean patients of COVID-19? This is in terms of the aerosol risk. And this is from Nigrims from the Department of Anesthesia and Critical Care.
So we've had experience of doing 2 percutaneous tracheostomies in patients, but we normally take a decision for a tracheostomy only after a period of 2 weeks, and by that time both these patients were RT-PCR negative as tested on multiple occasions, but they were difficult to wean. So we decided to perform an percutaneous tracheostomy, and why we did it in the ICU and did not transport them to the OR was for multiple reasons. One was the logistics, and then it was, one of them was hemodynamically not very stable. But there is a slight problem of doing COVID positive patients tracheostomies in the OR, and as all of us know, fogging is a big problem in the OR even for the smallest of cases. A tracheostomy, the surgeons normally end up having fogging within 20 minutes into the case, and therefore it is definitely difficult to do any surgical procedure wearing a full PPE. So from that point of view, I think doing a PCT is very safe and has to be encouraged, provided the staff doing it is facile in it. And if they do not have an experience and if the airway is very difficult, then I think it would be a better option to transfer them to the OR and do it under better conditions. But with the given team which has good experience with PCTs, there's no harm in doing a PCT, and the aerosol generation is almost equivalent in both, because we keep the patients well anesthetized and paralyzed, whether it is during a PCT or whether it's a surgical tracheostomy. So the possibility of the patient coughing or explosively generating aerosol particles is really quite remote. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. One other question which I can ask Dr. Anant Mohan. Favipiravir does it have a role in prophylaxis? And someone has written, is it a hero or is it zero?
So as of now, this antiviral drug doesn't really fit into the algorithm of treatment as of now, because the evidence to that effect is pretty meager. Of course, there are a couple of trials which are ongoing, but because of several factors, the data is mostly in vitro, and some very small other studies are there, but it is not good enough to advise this even as a treatment. So as a prophylaxis, I think it would be even more difficult to start advising this particular antiviral drug as a prophylactic role. So no. And the other thing is, there are many other problems. The dose of this, the number of tablets one has to take, almost 16 to 18 tablets, the cost, the side effects. So all that has to be taken into account when one is giving all these medicines. So as of now, there is no prophylactic role of this medicine.
So I agree with that. This is also something that was discussed in great detail. Anant was also there in the National Task Force, and the data was looked at very critically as far as favipiravir was concerned. It is an antiviral drug which came in for influenza, for H1N1 in 2014, was approved initially in Japan, and has also been used for Ebola. So it has a wide antiviral activity. But the data as far as COVID-19 is concerned is not strong enough. There are just two studies from China, but they are not studies have been not done very well. There's a lot of bias as far as the studies are concerned, and it was felt that we still need more data. And as Dr. Anand mentioned, that there are issues also of the number of tablets the person has to take and the side effects. So currently, and it is for 14 days also. So currently, I don't think there is enough evidence to say that favipiravir is going to be a game changer, and there is limited evidence to really advocate it as prophylaxis. The other question is the optimal time for remdesivir. Now, remdesivir is an antiviral drug. The data for that is again not that strong in terms of mortality benefit. There is some suggestion that it may have mortality benefit in moderate to severe cases, but it has not achieved statistical significance. What it has shown is that the days of hospitalization comes down, but the utility is maximum if it's given in moderate to severe cases. So in ideal situation, I would say the remdesivir would be useful if it's given somewhere around this, maybe the 6th to the 8th day or the 5th to the 8th day, in an individual whose oxygen saturation is falling, he's requiring high flow oxygen, and there are infiltrates which are appearing or are increasing on the chest X-ray, so that he is now having going in from a moderate to a severe disease. Early use of remdesivir in such patients may have a beneficial role, and that's where it should be placed. On the other hand, if you have an individual who goes on to what we call a cytokine storm, has increasing CRP, D-dimer, IL-6 levels are very high, then you're looking at giving anti-inflammatory drugs and anti-IL-6 drugs, and that's where you will give drugs like tocilizumab or itolizumab, which is now also available, and there's some limited data for that. And of course, steroids to play a pivotal role both in moderate to severe disease. You could give methylprednisolone or dexamethasone. And as we've already discussed, we would also continue to give anticoagulants. The important question which I am going to ask the panelists, and I'll see if I can help them out, is that if you have a person who is RT-PCR negative twice, HRCT shows classical GGOs, someone has even written CORAD 5/6, and CRP is very high, IL-6 is high, D-dimer is increasing. What is your diagnosis and how will you treat such a patient? So, who would like to take that, and I can try and then help you in answering that question, because this is a issue which has happened in other states also. I also know that there are certain cities where there was a problem or delay in getting the RT-PCR results, and the physician had to rely on just these reports which are available, and then there became ethical issues of should he treat this patient with antiviral, especially remdesivir, when you don't have a positive report. So maybe we can have a discussion and try and see if we can reach a consensus on this. Dr. Anand Mohan.
Yeah, so again, a situation which may arise, and as has said, has also arisen. We also faced this kind of a situation once, in the sense that it was a patient who tested negative here. Once we shifted to our ward, and it was classical features on X-ray were there, and the patient was hypoxic. So we repeated. Second time also was negative. We repeated again after 2-3 days, and then he came out to be positive. So this may happen. again you have to take the entire things into perspective, the clinical feature, radiology and the virology. If other things are compatible, probably one would go in for the basic treatment. You can start the steroids, start the low molecular weight heparin, start the oxygen therapy, give the NIV, give the high flow nasal cannula and oxygen therapy and everything. The problems will come if you are having to do anything beyond that. So that means the specific antivirals and all. I would say, of course, one may need to repeat the test once again maybe, because again, like Dr. Lalit said, the timing may not be right, maybe the sample taken may not be right, there can be many problems in the entire course of this whole procedure, transport problems, collection problems, so it is no harm in repeating it once more. If that is also negative, then maybe one can take a conscious decision and discuss with the relatives. If everything else is fitting into COVID, discuss with the relatives that look, we have one or two options. Remdesivir is there, tocilizumab is there. We don't have a clear-cut diagnosis, but there is a very high clinical suspicion. There is a pandemic which is ongoing. So maybe with proper consent, with proper telling them with the proper risk-benefit ratios, the side effects and all, one can maybe take a very conscious and careful decision to go ahead with maybe one of the other specific therapies. That is probably what I would say.
Dr. Rajesh, you want to add anything?
No, I agree entirely with Dr. Anant Mohan. I think to isolate this patient and to treat him on a very high index of suspicion is, I think, the cornerstone of treatment, knowing that we are in the midst of a pandemic and we may have a likelihood of a missed RT-PCR. That doesn't really say that the patient can be just discharged anywhere.
So I think the important message here is that this is something which can occasionally happen, and you have to look at the entire clinico-radiological picture and the patient's background before you take a decision to treat one way or the other. The first thing would be isolate the patient, and unless proved otherwise, you must consider this patient as being COVID positive, and therefore don't send him into a general ward where he can cause infection to other. He should be either in a COVID suspect area or in an area which is isolated, because he's neither COVID positive, but he is suspect, and he's neither COVID negative. So you will have to keep it in an isolation facility. At the same time, try and repeat tests, as we've already shown that sometimes a bronchoalveolar lavage or doing a sample from the lower respiratory tract may give you a higher yield as the disease progresses, and that is something that you can do. So keep trying to get a positive report, because that will make life much more easier. But if that is not there, then as Dr. Anant Mohan said, you need to discuss this with the patient's relatives, take a conscious decision. You have to take their consent. And if you have a situation where you feel that the patient is showing deterioration, there is worsening, his requirement of oxygen is going down, and you are in a area where there is a high chance that there is an ongoing active pandemic, COVID-19 cases are significantly high there, I would say that after taking a consent, you could consider giving antivirals, you should give steroids, you could also consider giving anticoagulants. Even if you have an atypical viral infection which is causing these type of features, it is justified to give anticoagulants and steroids in such a situation based on what is the current data. On the other hand, the debate would always be on remdesivir and subsequently on tocilizumab. I think that is where you will have to take a conscious decision, but it is something which is challenging, and one will have to look at it on a case-to-case basis. So these are challenges that one will face as we go along managing these patients. One question which is basically maybe to Dr. Rajeshwari and Dr. Anant Mohan, in terms of your policy for doing CPR in COVID positive patients.
CPR is never denied to a COVID positive patient at the outset, and we have had a very large number of patients with CKD who have come with hyperkalemia and have had an arrest. So if it's because of a treatable cause, normally we do not stop the CPR, and we've had good results and good outcome. We've had patients completely who have recovered. However, on the other hand, there's a lot of ethical and medico-legal dilemma in patients who have very severe comorbidities or who have been on ventilator and who are not showing any signs of improvement, and have then gone on to develop VAP and are in septic shock and then deteriorate. And we all know that they cannot be revived, or especially at extremes of age, especially the very old people. So we still do have a medico-legal dilemma in these cases, but we do not really have do not resuscitate orders unless if the patient's family has been taken into confidence and if there is any indication from them that they do not want any CPR or any other measures to be done. And this has happened in, I think, one patient where the patient was about 90 years old and they did not want any CPR. Otherwise, we do follow the CPR guidelines as per the American Heart Association. We have the modified COVID CPR guidelines.
Okay. Okay, so thank you very much. There are other issues. One is the role of aspirin with heparin. I don't think we have enough data to say that adding aspirin to the anticoagulants that you're giving gives any added benefit. So as of now, we are not recommending that combination of aspirin or any other antiplatelet drug should be given along with heparin or low molecular weight heparin. The other question that is there is the role of NOACs, the novel oral anticoagulants. Currently, the data is not there, and as Dr. Anant Mohan said, we are not giving it. NOACs role after discharge. There are certain centers in the US which will do a risk assessment of individuals at the time of discharge, and then if there is a higher chance of thromboembolic complications even occurring after discharge, they would put the patient on NOAC. That is, if you have a person who is obese, has pedal edema, is bedridden, or has a higher chance of developing deep vein thrombosis, then they would give the novel oral anticoagulants for the newer oral anticoagulants for 4 to 6 weeks, and the NOACs are then given, but we are not doing that as far as India is concerned. You could take a risk assessment of a patient on discharge, and if you feel there's a very high risk of deep vein thrombosis, you may continue oral anticoagulation. It could even be acetrom if you wanted to do that, but I don't think there's enough evidence one way or the other to support its use. The role of steroids in mild cases, there's no evidence to show it's useful. Even if you look at the data from the recovery trial, the benefit was only in those patients who had moderate to severe cases. It can sometimes be more harmful if you're giving it in mild cases. So there is no role for giving steroids in patients who are having mild symptoms or who are even asymptomatic. Ideal time for plasma therapy. Ideal time for plasma therapy, again, one should understand that when you're talking of plasma therapy, the data again is not that strong. You're giving convalescent plasma. So it's a different from plasma. Plasma itself may also be useful. We give it for various other indications, and therefore it may help as far as the hypercoagulable state is concerned. But when you're giving convalescent plasma, it's important to evaluate the plasma that it has sufficient antibodies to be called convalescent plasma. So all plasma that you get from a person who's recovered from COVID may not have sufficient antibodies. And it is usually to be given in moderate disease, and again, it's usually found to be benefit in the earlier stage rather than late, because at the later stage, the individual's own body produces enough antibodies, and giving more antibodies from outside is usually not much use. So there are studies which have shown that if you look at the antibody titer in these sick patients at a later stage, the antibody titer is very high, and you really don't need to give convalescent plasma in them. So it is something that we can do. Then one question is whether there is any interaction between dexamethasone and remdesivir, and whether we should avoid giving the combination. I don't think that there is any evidence to that extent. If Dr. Anant Mohan wants to add anything to that. So I don't think there is, and we are routinely giving the combination without any problem. What the dose of steroids that we are giving, maybe you can add, because we are giving methylprednisolone as of now.
Yeah, so we are giving methylprednisolone and dexamethasone. These are the two things that one can give. So in moderate to severe, it depends. Anywhere dexamethasone, anywhere between 4 to 8 milligrams is okay, and for methylpred, anything about. So they are basically almost the same with each other as far as the potency is concerned, and they are approximately 4 to 5 times more potent as compared to the prednisolone. So if we give the equivalent doses, then I think it should be all right. Anything between say 0.5 to 0.2 milligram per kg per day should be all right in a single dose. Sometimes some people give it in a double dose, so that's enough for a 8 to 10 day period more often than not.
Okay, then the other issue is about hydroxychloroquine prophylaxis and the duration for that. Now again, this is a debatable issue because the data is not that strong. It's based on more of lab data and rather than good robust clinical trials. There's just very few clinical trials which have looked at hydroxychloroquine prophylaxis. I'm aware that there are 2 large studies which have been started, one being done in the US by Duke's University and one in Europe, where more than 1,000 healthcare workers are being enrolled to see for the benefits of hydroxychloroquine prophylaxis. But these studies will take some time. Currently, whatever data we have is basically some review data from our own institute, some which was done by ICMR, and some data which is also published in the IJMR, and some data from Delhi hospitals, which tends to show that there is some benefit of giving hydroxychloroquine to healthcare workers in terms of its protective value, and the healthcare workers who took it regularly did have lesser infection with COVID-19, but there could be a lot of other confounders as far as this interpretation is concerned. But we are recommending that all healthcare workers should take it, and it can be taken once a week once you've taken the loading dose, and it can be taken for a long time. We are initially recommended for 8 weeks, but now as long as a pandemic is there and you're getting exposed, you can take it weekly for even 12 to 14 weeks or longer. Many of our patients who are on hydroxychloroquine on a daily dose are on a daily dose of hydroxychloroquine for months or years without any problem. So taking it weekly for a few months, I don't think should be of great concern. I think we've tried to answer most of the question. There's one question which I think is there as far as a lot of surgeons are concerned, testing before surgery and protection of patients and surgeons as far as COVID-19 is concerned. So here I think there are two things that we need to bring out. One is that there is now data which suggests that if an individual is suffering from COVID-19 and has a routine surgery or develops COVID-19 infection in the subsequent post-operative period, then the overall mortality, follow-up mortality is much higher. In a data published in the Lancet Respiratory Medicine, the mortality was almost more than 30% in those who became COVID positive and had infiltrates in the chest X-ray. And it was even higher in those who did not, even had a mild disease but were COVID positive. Therefore, it's very important that we be careful about whom we take up for surgery, and if elective surgery can be postponed, that would be a better option. But this is, in most hospitals, surgeons will not take up a patient for any procedure unless a COVID test is negative, because it's to protect themselves and, of course, the patients. This is also something that we've discussed in ICMR just over the weekend, and ICMR is also now coming out with guidelines which suggest that in all patients going in for any interventions, surgery, or people who are immunocompromised, who get into the hospital, they should have first a rapid antigen test kit, and if that test is negative, they can go ahead and get an RT-PCR done, which can be done by the standard RT-PCR or by CBNAT. So this is what the protocol that would be followed, because as we start opening up for non-COVID care, there will always be the COVID in the background and the chance of infection happening, and we will start seeing COVID infection in non-COVID areas because of the fact that we will start admitting patients, and we know that many COVID positive patients can be asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic and therefore may come in for a procedure without any respiratory symptoms or any other symptoms to make one suspect that this person is having COVID infection. Therefore, both from the patient's morbidity and mortality point of view and protection from healthcare workers, doing a test before the procedure is important. But it's also important to remember the test should be done maybe 24 to 48 hours before the procedure. Doing it 2 weeks before the procedure is of no use, because then you person may have got exposed in the intervening period. So timing of the test linked to the procedure is also important, so that we are able to protect the patient and the healthcare workers who are this thing. Okay, we'll just take one or two questions, and the other questions we'll take in the next grand round, where we will try and discuss another topic and thereby be able to really cover things like what are the role of various new drugs, or the extrapulmonary manifestation of COVID, or other things like hospital infection control. This is for Dr. Ashu said, any role of MRI chest for diagnosis?
So not really. Why would we want to do an MR chest? Primarily because, MR chest has come a long way, and we have been like flag bearers and of MR chest and saying do MR chest instead of CT in several situations. But in an acute situation like a SARI situation, no, we are happy doing a CT scan, because we can have a patient in and out of the CT scan in like a minute and a half or 2 minutes. However rapid MR protocols you apply, you cannot be this fast. It cannot be this fast. And then, sanitizations of MR equipment, etc., and shifting the patient if he is ventilated should have only MR compatible equipment. So no, it's not advocated as of now, and it doesn't offer us any advantage over CT. So we would not go for MR except for brain.
Thank you. There are other 1 or 2 questions which I'll try and answer, and maybe see if there's someone in the group who would like to answer that. One is that why are we not testing at the time of discharge or once the patient has become cured? This is basically based on the fact that there were recent studies which suggested that after 7 to 10 days of infection, if you are totally asymptomatic, or if you are mildly symptomatic and you have had 10 days of between your test and the current day and at least 3 days of no symptoms, then you are very unlikely to have viable virus in your nasopharyngeal passages and you are not infectious. However, you may still have dead virus or non-viable virus in the nasopharyngeal passage, and your RT-PCR may be falsely positive. It's not actually falsely positive, it is picking up the virus, but this will not grow on culture. And therefore, it was felt that there is really no need to do repeated testing. So if you remember, in the early days, we used to say that isolate or quarantine for 14 days, and after 14 days of isolation, you should have 2 RT-PCR negative 24 hours apart to really say that the person is now cured and can be sent home. But this was changed. The national guidelines have also been changed. CDC also has changed its guidelines because it was found that this is not something that is scientifically required. And therefore, if you are asymptomatic and have crossed 10 days, or you have done 10 days and 3 days have crossed where you have no symptoms, then one can consider that you are cured and you can actually go back to work or join back, and that should not be a problem. The other issue was that some patients may have some symptoms even when they are discharged. Chronic cough is one which may persist for a long period of time, and this could be just because of some degree of airway irritation or hyperreactive airways, which can happen because of a viral infection. Sometimes some patients may have a lower oxygen saturation, and this is a question which has come up, that if the saturation is low but the patient is otherwise totally recovered and is asymptomatic, can he be sent home? He can be sent home. I would advise that we should encourage him to do some degree of pulmonary rehabilitation to really build up his pulmonary reserve and improve his oxygen saturation. However, there are some patients who have extensive lung damage, fibrosis in the lung, which can occur as a residue of ARDS. We know that ARDS can cause fibrosis in the lung. And there have been a few patients that have actually been discharged on long-term home oxygen therapy because of extensive damages. We've seen follow-up CT scans of patients after even 3 months, which continue to show fibrotic changes in the lung. Dr. Ashu can sort of expand on that. And therefore, there can be some long-term residual changes both in the lung and other organs, which can lead to impairment as far as quality of life is concerned in these individuals. So you may have individuals whose saturation may continue to be low, but that does not mean that they're infectious or they cannot be sent home. So you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, so, post-COVID fibrosis is a reality that we will all be waking up to, and we have now started having our first wave of second admissions in these patients. And some of them may have had some pre-existing ILD also, which got worsened, and in several of them the fibrosis is de novo. We have had a few admissions, as of now only 5 to 6 in number, where we've had to look at significant shortness of breath, where the patient has presented to the ER with a shortness of breath, and in a couple of weeks perhaps we will have more experience to come back on this.
So one question for Lalit: Are some tests fake? Are some test kits fake?
That's a very difficult one, sir. As far as I am aware, ICMR is validating each of these kits which are available in the market. The list is up on the ICMR site. So I think it is best to take a look at that list and ensure that the vendor is an authorized vendor.
So all of the tests which are up there have to be validated by the ICMR, and it's there on their website. So if the kit is up on ICMR website, it has been actually validated in field conditions, and then only is it approved. So you must look it up before you use the kit, because both for the rapid test and for others antibody testing, a large number of kits are coming up in the market, but many of them have not been validated, and so they can be kits which are of inferior quality. One question is for quarantine for healthcare workers after exposure to suspect COVID positive without PPE. If you have a close contact, and there is a way of trying to really identify whether the person has had a close contact. Is the contact for more than 15 minutes? Was the both individuals wearing a mask? How close was the contact? Was it less than 2 meters or was it more? Based on that, you can actually classify whether this is a close contact or not. And if there is a close contact and there is a high risk of exposure, the individual has to be quarantined. In our healthcare workers, what we also do is that usually between the 5th to 7th day, we will also do an RT-PCR test to see whether the person is positive or not. If he is asymptomatic and the test is negative on the 7th day, he could come back to work. But if there's a lot of concern, you could have this individual stay in quarantine for 14 days. So that will depend. We would usually have the person back after the 7th to 10th day if his RT-PCR is negative. We've tried to answer a lot of questions, but I know that there are many still pending. Many of them we could not take because of shortage of time, and I can see there are still questions coming up regarding role of CT scan, thrombolysis in patients, and cone beam CT and things like that. We'll try and take them up next time because we've already exceeded our time, unless you want to take one or two questions in the end. Reinfection chances is the other thing. Currently, there is some degree of antibody or T-cell immunity which does happen in patients who have been infected. So chance of reinfection currently are less, but how long this immunity lasts is not very clear. And therefore, whether you can have a reinfection in the coming months, I think only the follow-up data will be able to tell us what happens. This is a test, is rapid antigen test sufficient before doing an endoscopy? Again, like I said, that the first test should be a rapid antigen test, but if your clinical suspicion is high, then you may have a false negative rapid antigen test, and then either a CB-NAT or an RT-PCR test should be done. So therefore, in such a situation, probably you should look at a CB-NAT or an RT-PCR test if you're doing an endoscopy and your suspicion is high, because the healthcare workers and the people in the room have a very high chance of getting exposed to an individual who may be pre-symptomatic or be asymptomatic and be COVID positive. So it's better to be safe, especially when we have an ongoing pandemic. What I would request is that we will try and see if we can answer your questions or collate them and try and take them up next time. We have actually crossed our time. We've actually crossed 4:30. We were trying to do it till 4:15, but now we've gone past 4:30. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone, especially the panelists and the faculty, especially Dr. Anand Mohan, because he came in at short notice. And I think we've had a very interesting discussion, but we will try and do this every week, and please do send your feedback on the same WhatsApp call number that we had initially given, that is 9999692364, and we will try and have this at a national level with faculty and cases from all across the country, so that there can be a good discussion as far as managing COVID-19 is concerned. And each time we will try and bring up some special topic or something different as far as the area of discussion is concerned. Today's discussion was predominantly on testing and how we have to look at not only RT-PCR, but RT-PCR and radiology in making a diagnosis. I would say you have to look at clinical picture, you have to look at RT-PCR, and you have to look at radiology, and then look at the patient as a whole, and then combine your management strategy. Remember, COVID-19 is no longer just a viral pneumonia. It's a systemic disease with significant extrapulmonary manifestation. We know that the virus itself is cytotoxic. It can lead to through thrombotic state. It can come using the ACE2 receptors enter various organs, including the kidney, the liver, and the GIT. It can cause a number of other manifestations which can happen in sepsis also, like cytokine storm, and therefore management is challenging, but we'll try and address all of these issues in the coming weeks. So thank you very much, and from the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi, I'd like to take this opportunity to everyone who's logged on, and maybe we had some glitches as far as the networking was concerned. We'll try and resolve that next time. This is the first time that we try to do it at this large scale, but we will try and make this a weekly event, and I hope that it picks up and all of you are able to gain from this. But do remember to send your feedback and any advice as to how we can further improve. Thank you very much.